Hello and welcome to this session. Today what we are going to be doing is taking a comparison look between our capital and labour intensive. Then at the end we're going to do a bit of an evaluation to see which one is best depending on the situation and circumstance. But to start off with, what do we mean by capital intensive within operations? Well, essentially, capital intensive is when the business takes significant investments into machinery and equipment to produce their products and their services. So some examples where you would have seen, capital intensive companies. Well, firstly, think of your car manufacturers. You've got companies such as Toyota, Vauxhall, Ford, Audi, VW, Tesla, and of course as well within our energy production. So these are the type of businesses that will be using more machinery, more equipment to produce their products or service and deliver them also. But what are the advantages and disadvantages of being and operating as capital intensive? Well, first of all, the main advantage comes from the fact that if you are employing obviously machines and automation, well, they will work at quicker rates. They will automate 24/7 sometimes where they are operating all day round. But when you compare obviously working with employees, we have 8-hour shifts, multiple breaks in between. So not only can machinery work for a lot longer, but as we've said, it can also work at higher efficiency rates. And as well, when we look at machinery and equipment, on average, the quality that they produce is also a lot higher because there is fewer defects. You don't run the risk of human error. Think, for example, if you was to employ people to make a car from scratch, it's going to be, well, first of all, it's going to take a very long time, but you also have to ask the questions about what issues are they going to have with trying to produce the product, to produce the car? Is it going to necessarily be of high quality? Maybe not. And it's also easier for a business to obviously operate on a mass scale because when we look at our machinery and our automations, they obviously work and produce products a lot quicker, which means that they can also produce at mass scale. And by producing at mass scale, we can start to meet higher level of demands, so obviously increasing more revenue. As well, another advantage when looking at being capital intensive is that because you are operating at these higher efficiency rates, over the long term, you begin to see lower costs, and especially unit costs. Because remember, yes, you're going to have to require a lot of investment at the start, which obviously increases your total costs, but over time, because you are producing more units, your unit cost begins to reduce. And as we've already mentioned, some machinery can also operate 24/7. Yes, you may need to schedule some maintenance and breaks, but majority of the time it is operation. Compared to people, we only work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and have multiple holidays, take the weekends off. So machinery can work and operate for a lot longer. Nevertheless, there are some major drawbacks when it does come to our capital intensive businesses. As we've said, to get the machinery, to get all the equipment to set up with, this is going to cost a lot of money, which is why it's important to conduct these investment appraisals, payback period, average rate of return and net present value to see what is your return on investment. And as we said, we will need to conduct some maintenance and repairs, and this obviously costs money. So by increasing your operational expenses will reduce your operational profits. And also machinery and equipment are less adaptable to change because the machine itself or the equipment that we're using may only be fit for one purpose, for only producing one certain type of product. And this thing obviously causes issues because if we do need to adapt the product, do we need to alter the machinery? Do we need to obviously buy in new machinery as well? Which once again can cost the business a lot of money. And finally, if a business was to change from a labour intensive where they're using people to a capital intensive, well, replacing people with machines, first of all, you can start to question the business's ethics. But then with the people that are left at the company, they may not necessarily feel secure within their jobs. So we then have to obviously ask questions about motivation, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that job security, because they feel, well, If those people have been replaced by machines, when is it my turn next? So now we've covered what we mean by capital intensive, let's take a look at what we mean by labour intensive. You could probably guess what it means because capital intensive is all about using machines and equipment. Labour intensive is all about using people. So labour intensive is when a business relies heavily on human labour. We rely on people rather than machinery or equipment to produce our products and services. And some examples of businesses who operate as a labour intensive company. Think of restaurants. You have chefs who cook the food, you have waiters who bring them out, you have bar staff who obviously pour the drinks for you. And also we've got our retail stores. You've got people who serve you in the cashier. But of course, a lot of these retail shops, they are beginning to transfer into this capital intensive and replacing people with machinery. But we still do have major, it's labour intensive. Bakery, obviously people do all the baking. We've got people stacking shelves, we've got people who are cleaning as well. But of course, you will see a lot of businesses, as we've said, begin to introduce more machinery, more robotics and automation into the production of their products and services and delivery of the service. So, what are the advantages and disadvantages of being labour intensive? Well, first of all, it is going to be a lot less expensive because in comparison to capital intensive, you are going to have to spend lots of money to buy in the machinery and equipment. Now, if you are a startup business, you don't have a lot of spare cash to lie about and invest into this machinery, then it's going to be more ideal that you have and start out as a labour intensive company. Something else as well, it will provide a lot more employment because of course labour intensive, we need people. And of course, if we are hiring people, we are paying people the money. And people, they then spend more money. And then this begins to boost our economy. And as well, it allows for more personalised services. So for example, when you need that human connection, it's a lot better. For example, think of a barber. A barber will definitely need to be more labour intensive. Well, for the time being, obviously, I don't think I've seen a capital intensive where you don't interact with any people at all. Normally, it is all labour intensive. However, there are some drawbacks for these labour intensive companies. Well, first of all, you will have higher long-term costs because think about the recruitment, selection and training process. You have to spend lots of money with them and obviously they don't produce at greater efficiency rates as obviously automation and robotics. There's also greater vulnerability in terms of the quality because you also have to run the risk of human error. But whereas when it comes to machinery, you're less likely to run into product defects because you program in the machinery and the equipment not to have any mistakes. It also heavily relies on the availability of skilled workers. So for example, let's take a barber shop. Of course, it's going to be labour intensive, but the quality of the entire business will depend on the availability of high quality barbers wanting to work for them. So now we've taken a look at the main difference between labour and capital intensive. We want to start evaluating this. We want to see whether a business should be labour or capital intensive. But when answering this question, it will depend on a few different factors. First of all, it will depend on the type of industry. So for normally the manufacturing products and services who want to do this at mass scale, you'll normally find it's a lot more capital intensive. Whereas services sometimes are a lot more labour intensive. Think of a service such as getting your hair cut. You need that personal interaction. It will also depend on the cost of labour and the cost of capital. Now, I know we said cost of capital is obviously going to be very expensive to set up, but maybe in the long term, it'll probably be a little bit cheaper than the cost of labour. We'll also have to consider what resources do we have available to us now. As I said, for a new startup business who doesn't have a lot of cash to invest, then probably labour intensive is the way to go. But if you are a massive company, you're focusing on gaining economies of scale through technical methods by becoming more efficient, then adopting more machinery and automation and becoming more capital intensive may be beneficial. And of course as well, we're just going over the scale of operation. And finally, it depends on what your objectives are and what your unique selling point is. Because if you're basing yourself on flexibility, then potentially having more labor intensive because people can be a little bit more flexible, versus when we look at efficiency, because efficiency requires high level of output with minimal waste, then maybe being a bit more capital intensive would be beneficial if a business did have objectives around improving their efficiency. Thank you for watching this session on labor versus capital intensive, and I'll see you in the next one.